Welcome to Ibrahim Traoré Person, the channel where hidden truths are revealed and the untold struggles of Africa's rising leaders come to light. Here, we uncover the stories the world tried to bury, the racism they faced, and the courage that turned whispers into roars. If you believe history should be told through the eyes of those who lived it, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, because the silence ends here. They told him to stay quiet. They told him to follow orders, to salute the flag of a power that was not his own, to believe Africa's destiny could only be written by others. But Ibrahim Traoré did not listen. In whispered boardrooms and international summits, the world described him as just another soldier, a temporary name in a long-forgotten list. Yet, when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a generation suffocated by centuries of racism. They tried to dismiss him as reckless, label him as dangerous, silence him with doubt. Instead, his defiance turned those whispers into roars, forcing the world to face a question it had long avoided. What happens when Africa refuses to bow? The story of Ibrahim Traoré begins not in the polished halls of Western capitals, but in the dusty streets and silent fields of Burkina Faso, a nation too often overlooked on the global stage. For decades, the international system has described African nations as fragile, unstable, or not ready for full independence. These are not neutral words. They are laced with racism, built on the assumption that Africans can fight, bleed, and sacrifice, but cannot think, build, or lead. This was the environment that shaped young soldiers like Traoré, who grew up watching his people endure poverty while their country's resources enriched others far away. From the beginning, the cards were stacked against him because the world had already written his story before he could tell it himself. The global narrative about African soldiers was especially brutal. To the West, African soldiers were portrayed as fighters, useful only on battlefields, never as visionaries or thinkers. International media painted them as men of violence, incapable of strategy, and rarely mentioned the countless sacrifices they made to protect their lands. When leaders did emerge, they were often reduced to caricatures: strongmen, rebels, or dictators. But behind these labels was something far more insidious: an unspoken belief that leadership, intellect, and statesmanship belonged to the West, while Africans were destined to remain in shadows. It was against this deeply entrenched prejudice that Traoré began his rise. Burkina Faso itself carried scars of this system. Once a French colony, it was tied to a web of unequal agreements long after independence. French troops were stationed on its soil, foreign corporations drained its resources, and its currency remained linked to Paris. For many, this arrangement felt like a softer version of colonialism, a reminder that freedom had been declared, but not fully realized. Traoré, as a young officer, saw this reality every day: soldiers struggling with outdated equipment while their land produced gold, children growing up in poverty while Western powers controlled wealth beneath their feet. These contradictions burned inside him, shaping his understanding of injustice. But what set Traoré apart was not just anger, it was clarity. He understood that the greatest weapon the world used against Africa was not just economic control or military dominance, but perception. If Africans could be convinced that they were incapable of leading themselves, the chains of racism would remain, invisible yet unbreakable. He also saw how subtle the racism was in international politics. The condescending smiles in diplomatic meetings, the lectures about responsibility from nations that once enslaved millions, the expectation that African leaders should be grateful for aid while their own wealth was siphoned away. These moments were not isolated. They were a system of reminders, whispering that Africa should know its place. And yet, amid all this, a shift was beginning. Across Africa, a younger generation was refusing to accept silence. They were angry at seeing their nations trapped in cycles of dependency, angry at leaders who bowed their heads in front of foreign powers, angry at being told that their dreams were unrealistic. Ibrahim Traoré embodied this generation, not because he was the loudest, but because he spoke with calm intelligence, combining the discipline of a soldier with the conviction of someone who believed Africa's destiny could change. His rise was not accidental. It was the product of decades of frustration, of centuries of racism that tried to suffocate the African spirit but could never extinguish it completely. By the time Traoré stepped onto the global stage, the world had already judged him. Just another soldier, they whispered, dismissing him before he could even speak. But those who looked closer saw something different. They saw a man who carried himself with quiet defiance, who refused to let centuries of racial prejudice dictate how he would be remembered. And slowly, whispers of doubt turned into murmurs of curiosity, because this young soldier was about to challenge the story the world thought it had already written about Africa. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré was not the story of a sudden rebellion, but of a slow build, an accumulation of frustrations, betrayals, and silenced voices that eventually became impossible to ignore. In the years before his leadership, Burkina Faso was caught in a deadly paradox. On paper, it was an independent nation. In reality, its sovereignty was constantly undermined by outside forces. French troops patrolled its streets under the banner of counter-terrorism, yet terrorist attacks continued to multiply. Foreign companies dug deep into its earth, pulling out gold worth billions, yet schools went unfunded and hospitals lacked even the most basic supplies. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the question became unavoidable. If foreign powers were truly there to help, why did life never seem to get better? This disillusionment was not new. Across Africa, the same story had been repeated. Soldiers promised protection, only to see villages burned. Leaders promised partnership, only to be humiliated in front of the world. The racism embedded in these arrangements was subtle but sharp. Western officials spoke of Africans as if they were eternal children, incapable of defending themselves, incapable of managing wealth, incapable of governing without guidance. In public speeches, they offered phrases like support and assistance, but in private, their policies revealed mistrust. When African leaders demanded fair contracts for resources, they were accused of corruption. When they sought military independence, they were painted as reckless. Every move was filtered through a lens of prejudice that assumed Africans could not possibly know what was best for Africa. It was against this backdrop that young officers, including Ibrahim Traoré, began to ask dangerous questions. Why should Burkina Faso's security be outsourced to foreign armies that failed to deliver results? Why should its gold enrich companies abroad, while Burkinabe children studied by candlelight? Why should their national currency be printed in Paris, chained to an economy that served others more than themselves? These questions were not welcomed by those in power. Speaking them aloud was seen as disloyal, even treasonous. But within the barracks, within student circles, within homes where families whispered after dark, the questions spread like wildfire. The older generation of leaders often warned patience. This is the way the world works, they said. We cannot confront the West. We must compromise to survive. But compromise had been the African condition for too long. To the youth, compromise no longer looked like survival. It looked like slow death. And in this generational divide, men like Traoré found their purpose. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but he was among the most determined. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen too much injustice to remain silent. International powers, however, continued to underestimate him. They saw a young officer in his 30s and dismissed him as inexperienced. They believed their influence over Burkina Faso was secure, that another African soldier could not possibly challenge centuries of established order. But here again, racism blinded them. They could not imagine that Africans had studied their systems closely, understood their weaknesses, and prepared strategies of their own. For every speech in Paris about partnership, there was a young African leader who saw through the performance and began quietly planning alternatives. Then came the breaking point. As terrorist attacks intensified in Burkina Faso, despite years of Western intervention, patience in the army and among civilians shattered. Villages were left defenseless, families displaced, and faith in the government collapsed. It was no longer just about economics or sovereignty. It was about survival. And when survival is at stake, people look for leaders who act, not leaders who bow. Traore and his allies recognized this moment. If they did nothing, their country would continue its slow unraveling. If they acted, they risked everything, but they also had a chance to change history. What unfolded next was not a random seizure of power, but a carefully calculated stand. When Traore emerged as the new leader, he spoke not with arrogance, but with conviction. His words carried a message that resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. We will not be slaves in our own land. It was a declaration that tore through decades of racist narratives. The West had painted African soldiers as thoughtless instruments of violence. Yet here was a soldier articulating a vision of sovereignty, justice, and dignity. His rise became a mirror, forcing the world to confront the double standard it had long denied. That when Western nations defended their sovereignty, it was called patriotism. But when Africans did the same, it was branded as dangerous. This was the true rising action, not just Traore's ascent, but the collision of two stories, the one written by the West and the one Africans began writing for themselves. Every speech he gave, every policy he proposed, became an act of defiance against the idea that Africans should accept less. For the youth of Africa, it was a rallying cry. For the powers that had long exploited the continent, it was a warning that the old order was crumbling, and with each passing day, the tension grew. Would the West crush this defiance as it had done with others before? Or would Burkina Faso's fight for dignity spark a fire too large to extinguish? The world watched, uncertain, but one thing was clear. The quiet young soldier had stepped into history, and he was no longer asking for permission to lead. As the dust of resistance began to settle, what lingered was not silence, but the powerful echo of Ibrahim Traoré's defiance. For decades, Africa had been painted as dependent, broken, and incapable of rising without Western intervention. The world expected a young soldier like him to either fall in line or burn out quickly, but instead he became something larger, a living contradiction to the racist whispers that had once dismissed his continent. His decision to sever military dependence on France, to reforge partnerships with nations that treated Africa as equals rather than subordinates, carried more weight than any speech could. It was the embodiment of action that history would record, as a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for a continent long suffocated by prejudice and exploitation. The impact of his resilience was undeniable. Across Africa, ordinary people began to see his story as their own. Young men and women, once told that their ambitions should remain small, found themselves inspired by a soldier who refused to be reduced to stereotypes. Farmers in villages, students in classrooms, and workers in bustling cities began speaking his name with hope rather than caution. His choices reminded them that leadership was not about titles or approval from the West. It was about courage, responsibility, and the will to stand for one's people. This was not just politics. It was a rebirth of dignity. The Western media, once eager to dismiss him as another angry soldier, struggled to contain the narrative. Every action Traoré took seemed to dismantle the carefully constructed image of Africa they had perpetuated for centuries. When he spoke with calm intelligence, the stereotype of the irrational African leader collapsed. When he outmaneuvered powerful global players with strategy rather than violence, the myth of dependency shattered. And when he stood unwavering, in the face of threats and manipulation, He became proof that African strength did not require validation from outside forces. His defiance forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Racism had long been a tool to maintain control, and leaders like Traore were dismantling it piece by piece. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement was not geopolitical. It was spiritual. He reignited belief in Africa's potential within Africans themselves. The quiet whispers of resignation, the internalized doubts seeded by centuries of colonization and racism, began to fade. In their place, a louder voice emerged, one that declared, "We are capable, we are strong, we are enough." This transformation of mindset was the true revolution, one that no foreign army or sanction could suppress. The story of Ibrahim Traoré stands as a reminder. Racism thrives on silence, but courage has the power to turn whispers into roars. He showed the world that leadership is not measured by age, wealth, or approval, but by the willingness to fight for justice even when the odds seem impossible. His name became more than a headline. It became a symbol of Africa's rising generation, a beacon that declared the future would not be dictated by prejudice, but shaped by determination. And so, the question remains for all of us. When the world whispers at you to stay small, will you remain silent, or will you roar? The turning point arrived on a day when the nation held its breath, waiting to see whether Ibrahim Traoré's defiance would break under pressure or become unshakable. Standing before his people, with cameras broadcasting across the world, he did not look like a man uncertain of his path. He looked like a soldier who had carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders and chosen to stand firm, regardless of the cost. His words that day were not crafted by speechwriters or designed for applause. They carried the raw truth of a man who had lived the humiliation of dependency and sworn never to allow it again. When he declared that Burkina Faso would no longer bow to colonial control, the silence that followed was electric, as if the air itself had shifted. And then, in an instant, that silence broke into a roar. Tens of thousands filled the streets, chanting his name, their voices carrying a power that could not be measured in weapons or wealth. It was the sound of a people reclaiming their dignity. The West, unaccustomed to such open defiance from a small and often overlooked nation, reacted with fury. Sanctions were announced, diplomats warned of instability, and international media framed him as reckless, dangerous, even illegitimate. Behind closed doors, threats came. There were whispers of plots to undermine him, of powerful interests determined to ensure that no African leader could inspire such a movement without consequences. But Traoré stood unmoved. To him, this was not a political gamble, it was survival. He knew that if he faltered now, his people would return to the shadows of dependency, and Africa itself might lose the fragile hope beginning to spread across the continent. Instead of retreating, he advanced. Foreign military bases were ordered. To leave, their flags lowered in quiet humiliation. Contracts that siphoned away resources were reviewed, rewritten, or torn apart. He sought out partnerships not with those who demanded obedience, but with those who respected sovereignty. This was no easy path. It meant financial strain, uncertainty, and the constant risk of sabotage. Yet, with each step, his resolve grew sharper, and his people's pride swelled. They were no longer being told what to think or how to act. They were beginning to write their own story. On the streets, the shift was visible. Farmers, long dismissed as powerless, returned to their fields with renewed vigor, knowing their labor was no longer for the enrichment of outsiders, but for their own children's futures. Soldiers, once seen as mere pawns in someone else's strategy, began to march with heads high, carrying a loyalty not to foreign generals but to the soil beneath their boots. Teachers spoke to their students with new fire, reminding them of Africa's long history of kingdoms, scholars, and warriors who stood tall before colonizers arrived. For the first time in living memory, there was a sense of unity. not just in the capital, but across villages, towns, and remote corners of Burkina Faso. The climax of this journey was not only about Burkina Faso. Across Africa, the ripple was unmistakable. In Mali, Niger, and beyond, his courage inspired others to question the systems that had long held them captive. Citizens watched closely, whispering to each other that perhaps the chains of dependency were not unbreakable. Leaders found themselves under pressure to follow his example, to stand taller, to listen to their people instead of their patrons abroad. What had started as the defiance of one soldier was becoming a continent-wide stirring, a challenge to the idea that Africa's destiny must always be written elsewhere. Yet the risks were immense, and Traoré knew it. Every step forward was shadowed by the possibility of betrayal, of economic collapse, even of his own death. But this, perhaps, was the true essence of the climax, that a man with everything to lose still chose to act, not because he was guaranteed victory, but because he believed that dignity was worth any price. He became, in that moment, more than a leader. He became a symbol. His voice, steady against the storms of criticism, declared that submission was no longer an option. And so, as the sun set on that fateful day of his declaration, Burkina Faso stood transformed. No longer a silent, overlooked nation, it had become a beacon. The world watched with a mix of awe and unease as a young captain from West Africa shook the very foundations of an order that had seemed unshakable. This was not just politics. It was history being rewritten. In that moment, Traoré's courage became the climax of a story that belonged not only to him, but to every African who had ever dreamed of freedom.